This happened back in 2019. I was working as a night driver for a small charter bus company out of eastern Oregon, mostly doing the long overnight runs between the coast and the interior. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid all right, and I liked the quiet of driving through the dark, watching mile markers tick by while everyone in the back slept. Most of my regulars were elderly folks, church groups, and the occasional college student trying to save money on airfare. I'd been doing the route for about 2 years by that point, and I thought I'd seen just about everything you could see on a Greyhound-style overnight, from drunks trying to smuggle liquor on board to that one lady who brought a live rooster in a duffel bag. Nothing really surprised me anymore. Or at least I thought nothing did. The run I want to talk about was the Portland to Boise line, which took roughly 9.5 hours if traffic cooperated and we didn't hit weather in the pass. We'd leave Portland at around 9:45 at night and roll into Boise a little after 7 in the morning. It was my favorite shift because most passengers would fall asleep within the first hour, and I'd basically just have the road, my thermos of coffee, and whatever audiobook I was working through. This particular night was mid-October, and it was already getting cold in the mountains. The kind of cold where you can see your breath fog up against the windshield if you crack the driver's window. We had a full manifest, 41 seats, and I remember thinking it was going to be a long night because a full bus always meant somebody would need a bathroom stop at the worst possible time. I did my usual pre-departure walk through the aisle, counting heads, checking that everyone had their tickets scanned properly. That's part of the job. You never leave the depot without matching bodies to the manifest, because if somebody's missing, you have to hold. Everyone was accounted for, 41 passengers, 41 seats. I remember making eye contact with an older man in a brown coat sitting near the back, and he gave me this small, polite nod, and I nodded back and headed up to the driver's seat. I dimmed the interior lights, closed the doors, and pulled out onto I-84 heading east. For the first couple hours, everything was completely normal. The road was empty. The CB radio was quiet, and I could hear a few soft snores drifting up from the seats behind me. Around midnight, I stopped at the little travel plaza outside of Pendleton to swap out my thermos and let anyone who needed to use the restroom hop off for 10 minutes. 12 people got off, 12 people got back on. I did a quick head count as they reboarded, marked it on my clipboard, and pulled back onto the highway. And that's when I first noticed him. I glanced up at the interior mirror, the wide one that lets me see all the way to the back of the bus, and there was a passenger sitting perfectly upright in seat 27. He was wearing a dark suit, or at least it looked dark in the low cabin lighting, and his hands were folded on his lap. What caught my eye was that he wasn't slumped, wasn't leaning against the window, wasn't doing any of the things people do when they're trying to sleep on a bus. He was just sitting there, facing forward, not moving. I didn't think much of it at first. Some people just can't sleep on buses. I've had passengers stay awake the entire 9-hour route before, staring out the window the whole time. So I turned my eyes back to the road and kept driving. But over the next hour or so, I kept catching myself glancing up at that mirror, and every time I did, he was in the exact same position. Hands folded, head level, eyes forward. Not a twitch, not a shift, not a single adjustment. And after a while, it started to bother me in this small, nagging way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Around 2 in the morning, we were somewhere between La Grande and Baker City, the road winding through the darker stretches where there's basically nothing on either side but trees and the occasional deer reflector post. I was on my second cup of coffee, and I decided to do something I don't usually do. I flipped on the low aisle lights just for a second, pretending I was checking the floor for something so I could get a better look at seat 27, and when the light came on, I saw him clearly for a moment. Older man, maybe 60s, thin face, wearing what looked like a formal suit that was slightly out of date. His skin looked pale, almost gray in the yellow light, and his eyes were open, wide open, not blinking, just staring at the back of the seat in front of him. I flicked the lights off pretty quickly because I didn't want to wake anyone, and I told myself he was probably just one of those people who like to sit very still. Some people meditate. Some people have back problems and can't move. I came up with about 6 different explanations in the span of 30 seconds, but none of them really stuck. I kept driving. What else was I going to do? But now every few minutes I was checking that mirror, and every single time he hadn't moved. So the damn folded hand. My same forward stare. And the strangest part was that no one around him seemed to notice him. The woman across the aisle from him had her head against the window, sleeping. The guy in front of him had reclined his seat back almost into the man's lap, and the man hadn't reacted at all. Hadn't said anything, hadn't shifted, hadn't done that little sigh people do when a stranger invades their space. Nothing. Around 3 in the morning, we hit the outskirts of Baker City, and I had another scheduled stop at a small 24-hour diner where the company had an arrangement for driver breaks. This was a shorter stop, maybe 15 minutes, and only 2 or 3 people usually got off since it was so late. I pulled into the lot, killed the engine, and turned around in my seat to make the announcement. 15-minute stop, restrooms inside, please be back by 3:20. A handful of groggy people started shuffling toward the front, and I looked directly at seat 27. He was still there, still not moving, still staring forward. From the front of the bus, I could see him just as clearly as I'd seen him in the mirror, and up close, he looked even more wrong somehow. His chest wasn't rising. I watched for a good 10 seconds, and I couldn't see him breathing. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late. I was tidy. Old people breathe shallow sometimes. I got up, stretched my back, and stepped off the bus with the passengers who were disembarking. Inside the diner, I ordered a black coffee I didn't really need and stood by the window watching the bus. And I could see the silhouette of him through the tinted glass, still upright, still not moving. I asked the waitress if I could borrow the phone to call dispatch, just to check something on the manifest. She slid it across the counter without asking questions. The night dispatcher was a guy named Marv who I'd worked with for years. I gave him the run number and asked him to pull up the passenger list for me, specifically seat 27. There was a pause on the line, longer than it should have been, and then Marv said the name on the reservation and asked me why I was asking. I told him I just wanted to confirm somebody's ticket. Then I asked, kind of casually, when that reservation had been made. Another pause. Marv said the reservation had been in the system for a very long time. He said it was flagged as a standing hold, which meant it was a seat that had been paid for years ago and never released. He said he'd have to check the notes to be sure, but he thought it went back to the late 80s. I asked him what the name was again, and he repeated it. Then he said something else, and I remember it clearly because it made the coffee cup in my hand feel cold. He said the note attached to the reservation said the passenger was deceased. The seat had been paid for by the family in 1989 as a memorial hold after the man had died in a car accident on that same route. Every trip the bus made, seat 27 stayed reserved. Every trip. No one was ever supposed to sit in it. I didn't know what to say. I told Marv I'd call him back, hung up the phone, and just stood there in the diner for a minute with the fluorescent lights buzzing over my head and the smell of old fryer grease in the air. Then I walked back out to the bus. The passengers who'd gotten off were finishing up their smoke breaks and starting to reboard. I climbed the steps, gave my usual little nod to everyone as they came past me, and I walked slowly down the aisle toward the back. Toward seat 27, he was still there. Same position, same folded hands, same forward stare. Up close, I could see the fabric of his suit was old. The kind of cut you'd see in photographs from 30 or 40 years ago. His shoes were polished, but they were an older style too. And his skin, up close, wasn't just pale. It looked wrong in a way I don't really know how to describe. Like a photograph of skin instead of actual skin. I stood in the aisle next to him for maybe 10 seconds and I said softly, "Sir, are you okay?" He didn't respond. Didn't turn his head, didn't blink. I could see the reflection of the overhead light in his open eyes, and there was nothing behind them. It was like looking at the eyes of a doll. I don't know what came over me, but I reached out to touch his shoulder. My hand got maybe 6 inches away, and I just couldn't do it. Something in the back of my head, something old and animal, told me not to touch him. So I pulled my hand back and I walked to the front of the bus. And I sat down in the driver's seat and I gripped the steering wheel with both hands until my knuckles went white. I was really freaking out in my head, but I couldn't show it because there were still passengers boarding. We pulled out of Baker City at 3:22. I drove the next hour on pure autopilot. I didn't look at the mirror. I couldn't. Every time I felt the urge to glance up, I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. But eventually, I couldn't help it. Somewhere near Ontario, right before the Idaho border, I looked up, and he was gone. I mean, the seat was empty. No one was there. I stared at the mirror for so long that the bus started to drift, and I had to jerk it back into the lane. I told myself he'd gotten up and moved to a different seat, or gone to the little restroom at the back, but I hadn't heard a single footstep, and the door to the restroom hadn't opened. I would have heard the latch. I did another head turn, counted my mirror as best I could. 40 passengers visible, one seat empty, seat 27. The rest of the drive into Boise was the longest 3 hours of my life. I kept expecting to look up and see him back in that seat, or worse, standing in the aisle behind me, but nothing happened. The bus rolled into the Boise depot at 7:11 in the morning, right on schedule, and the passengers filed off one by one, groggy and stretching. I stood by the door and counted them as they left. 40, exactly 40. same as I had counted in the mirror. I went back through the bus after everyone was off, checking the seats and the overhead compartments the way I always did at the end of a run. Seat 27 was empty. No coat, no bag, no forgotten belongings. Nothing to suggest anyone had ever been there. But when I got closer, I noticed something on the seat cushion. It was a small pressed indent, like the shape of a person who'd been sitting there for a long time. And right in the middle of the seat, folded neatly, was an old ticket stub. Paper, not the printed thermal receipts we used. The kind of ticket the company hadn't issued in decades. The date on it was July 14th, 1989. I took the ticket stub up to the depot office, and I laid it on the desk in front of the morning supervisor. I told him the whole story. Everything. He listened without saying much, and when I was done, he just nodded slowly and told me to go home and get some sleep. He said he'd handle it. He said something under his breath that I didn't quite catch, something like it happens sometimes, and I asked him what he meant by that, and he wouldn't answer me. He just took the ticket, put it in an envelope, and slid it into the bottom drawer of his desk. Then he told me the reservation on seat 27 was permanent, and I shouldn't worry about it. He said the family had paid for it a long time ago, and the company honored the arrangement out of respect. And that was it, end of conversation. I drove that route for another 8 months before I finally quit. Not because of what I saw, not entirely. I quit because I saw him again. Twice. Once in November, once in February. Both times on the same overnight run, both times in seat 27, both times in the exact same position with his hands folded and his eyes open and his chest not moving. And both times when I checked the seat at the end of the run, it was empty, except for that same old paper ticket stub with the same date printed on it. July 14th, 1989. I never touched the ticket after the first time. I just left it there and let whoever cleaned the bus deal with it. The last time I saw him was the night before I put in my 2 weeks. It was a heavy snowstorm coming through the pass, and I was driving slower than usual, hands tight on the wheel, watching the taillights of a semi about a quarter mile ahead of me. I glanced up at the mirror and he was there. But this time, for the first time, he wasn't facing forward. He was looking directly at the mirror, directly at me, and his mouth was open just slightly like he was about to say something. I stared back for maybe 2 seconds before I forced my eyes back to the road, and when I looked up again, he was gone. I never found out who he was, not really. I know the name from the manifest, but I never looked up the accident, never tried to find the family, never went digging for the story. Some part of me didn't want to know. I figured whatever happened to that man on July 14th, 1989 was between him and whatever kept bringing him back to that seat every single night. I don't work night routes anymore. I do daytime local runs now. Short trips, school groups, airport shuttles, nothing overnight, nothing through the mountains. And every so often, when I'm driving during the day and the light hits the interior mirror just right, I catch myself checking seat 27 out of habit. It's always empty, but I still check. I don't really know how to end this story because it doesn't really have an ending. He's probably still there, riding that same route every night, sitting in that same seat, waiting for something none of us can see. And somewhere in a bottom drawer at the Boise Depot, there's probably a stack of old paper ticket stubs, all with the same date, quietly piling up year after year. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If this story got under your skin the way it still gets under mine, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Date if you want to hear more stories like this one. Share it with somebody who rides buses at night. And if you've ever had something happen to you on an overnight route, something you can't explain, drop it in the comments. I read them. I really do. Sleep well tonight. And if you ever find yourself boarding a late-night bus, do me one small favor. Don't sit in seat 27.